Varick's men had my wrist twisted hard enough to bruise, and the market gate where I had shared bread with a silent stranger for 4 months had never once felt this cold. "You have been feeding a king without knowing it," the taller one said, "which makes you either a fool or a threat, and I do not have the patience to determine which." "I have been feeding a hungry man," I said, "every single morning, without asking his name once. I did not need to know it to know he needed bread." Somewhere behind him, I heard a sound that did not belong to any ordinary market morning. Low, furious, and closing considerably faster than anything with that much weight had any right to move. I did not know yet whether 4 months of quiet kindness had bought either of us enough time to survive what came next. I only knew I was not sorry for a single piece of bread I had ever broken in half. Let me tell you how I ended up at that gate, because it started 4 months earlier. The first morning I broke my only piece of bread in half, without thinking twice about it. I was 22, an unclaimed omega surviving on what work the market's fishmongers and weavers could spare me, which was rarely enough to call a full meal, and never enough to call comfortable. I had grown up in the capital's poorest quarter, where hunger was simply the ordinary shape of a morning rather than an emergency. And I had learned early that sharing what little I had rarely cost me as much as keeping it all to myself cost my own conscience. I noticed him the first time, because everyone else at that gate went out of their way not to. He sat against the same worn stretch of wall every morning, filthy, silent, dressed in rags that had clearly seen considerably better years. And the market's regular traders treated him the way people treat furniture they have decided not to see, stepping around him without ever quite looking at him, occasionally kicking dust in his direction if he sat too close to a cart's path. I understood that particular blindness well enough. I had been on the receiving end of it more times than I cared to count, in years when my own circumstances had left considerably less room for pride than for simple survival. I did not have much. I had, that first morning, exactly 1 heel of bread meant to last me through a long day of carrying baskets for the fishmonger. And I broke it in half anyway, without so much as a moment's hesitation, and held the smaller piece out to him without a word. He looked at me for a long moment before he took it, something careful and searching in eyes that did not match the rest of his ragged appearance at all, though I did not think much of that detail at the time. He ate slowly, deliberately, and said nothing, and I left for my day's work without expecting to think of him again, my mind already occupied by the considerably more pressing question of whether the fishmonger would pay me before or after his own supplier settled up. I found him at the same spot the next morning, and the morning after that, and within 2 weeks it had simply become the shape of my day. I earned what I could, ate what little that bought me, and split it, always, without fail, with the silent stranger at the gate, who never once spoke a single word to me in return. I did not question the habit once it had taken hold. Some routines simply settle into a life without asking permission first, and this one had settled into mine as thoroughly as any I had ever kept. I did not know why he never spoke. I assumed, as most people in the quarter assumed of the silent and the desperate, that some old grief or injury had taken his voice, and I did not press him for an explanation he clearly was not offering. I talked enough for both of us most mornings, telling him about the fishmonger's temper, the weather, whatever small piece of the world I had noticed that day worth sharing. He listened. I came to understand, over those weeks, that listening was its own kind of conversation, and I found myself, somewhat to my own surprise, looking forward to it more than any other part of my day. I kept a small chipped wooden bowl for the purpose, breaking my bread into it each morning before dividing the pieces. A habit that made the ritual feel considerably less like charity and more like something shared properly between 2 people who had decided, without ever saying so aloud, that they mattered to each other. The other traders at the gate teased me, gently at first and then simply as a matter of habitual affection, about my silent companion. Old Meris, who sold pickled fish from the cart nearest the wall, took to saving him a strip of dried herring some mornings when her own catch had been generous, muttering that a man that quiet had probably suffered enough without also going hungry on her watch. I found, over those weeks, that my silent stranger had become something of a fixture the whole gate had quietly adopted, even as the wider market continued to step around him as though he were furniture. I did not mind the teasing. I found, if I am honest, that I looked forward to those mornings more than any other part of my day. The two of us sitting against that worn stretch of wall while the market woke up around us, my voice filling the silence he never once broke, his presence filling something in me I had not fully realized was empty until he arrived to occupy it. 4 months passed that way, and I noticed, over those months, small things I did not fully understand at the time. His hands, beneath the grime, were considerably steadier and stronger than a beggar's hands usually were. He watched the market with an attention that seemed less like idle observation and more like careful study. His eyes, tracking particular carts, particular officials, with a focus I found strange, but never questioned. Once, briefly, I saw him watching a grain cart being unloaded with an expression so cold and so calculating that it did not match the silent, gentle man I had come to know at all. I noticed, too, that he seemed to eat considerably less of my offered bread as the weeks wore on, taking only the smallest piece, even when I pressed a larger share on him, as though some part of him could not bear to take more from a woman who visibly had less to spare than he did. I did not understand, at the time, the particular irony of a king rationing himself against a market girl's kindness. I only understood, watching him, that whoever he had been before that gate, he had learned to carry his own hunger carefully, the way people do who have gone without before and never quite trust plenty when it arrives. I scolded him for it more than once, insisting he take the larger half regardless, and he simply shook his head each time, silent as ever, until I gave up arguing and settled instead for splitting each piece as evenly as my own hands could manage, so that neither of us went without more than the other. I did not know, sharing my bread with him that morning, that I was sitting beside King Draken himself, disguised and silent, quietly investigating why the capital's own grain reserves seemed to be shrinking faster than any official report accounted for. The reveal, when it came, arrived considerably faster and considerably more frightening than either of us had any way to prepare for. It began with rumours circulating through the quarter that the market gate's usual beggars were to be cleared away entirely, on the order of Lord Varick, the king's own grain steward, citing concerns about disease and disorder near the trading stalls. I did not think much of it at first, beyond the ordinary weary frustration of watching officials decide, without consultation, what was best for people they had never once bothered to speak with directly. Old Meris grumbled about it for a full morning, certain the order had more to do with keeping unpleasant reminders of hunger out of sight for visiting dignitaries than with any genuine concern for disease, and I remember thinking, at the time, that she was likely more right than either of us understood. It was only when Varick's men arrived at the gate itself, 3 mornings later, that I understood the clearing was not about disease at all. They moved through the gathered beggars roughly, checking faces against some description I could not see, and I watched, with growing alarm, as 2 of them stopped directly in front of my silent companion, studying him with a scrutiny that made my stomach drop entirely. "This is him," one said. "The description matches. Take him." He did not resist quietly. I watched, stunned, as the ragged, silent man I had shared bread with for 4 months rose to his full height, considerably taller and more imposing than his hunched posture at that gate had ever suggested, and said, in a voice that carried across the entire market with an authority I had never once heard from him, "You will release me, or you will explain to your lord exactly why you laid hands on your own king." The market did not simply go quiet. It went the particular silence that precedes either violence or history, every trader and buyer within earshot freezing entirely. Several nobles who had been passing through the quarter that morning going visibly, alarmingly pale. Varick's men, for their part, released him so fast one of them stumbled backward into a fruit cart, sending apples rolling across the cobblestones in a small, absurd counterpoint to the enormity of what had just happened. I did not go pale. I want that understood plainly, because it seemed, in that moment, the most important fact in the entire square. I looked at the man I had fed every single morning for 4 months, now standing revealed as the most powerful person in the kingdom, and felt, more than anything, simple relief that he was no longer in danger of being dragged off by strangers. Old Meris, beside me, had gone considerably paler than I had, her hand pressed flat against her chest, as though she needed the support of her own ribs to remain standing. "I gave him herring," she said faintly, to no one in particular. "I gave the king of the realm my second best herring, and told him to eat it before it spoiled. I believe he was grateful for it," I told her, and meant it entirely. "Are you still hungry?" I asked, because it was the only question that actually mattered to me in that moment, and because I found I did not know what else a person was meant to say to a king she had spent 4 months quietly feeding without knowing it. Something in his face, still streaked with the grime of his disguise, did something I had never once seen from him, not the careful stillness I had grown used to, but open, unguarded astonishment. "You are asking if I am hungry," he said, after learning I am your king. "You are still the man who ate my bread every morning," I said. "I do not see why that should stop mattering simply because I now know your title." He explained himself to me properly that same evening. Once Gunnar, his second, had escorted us both to a private chamber in the palace I had never once expected to set foot inside. "Reports reached me nearly 5 months ago," Draken said, "of grain shortages in the poorest quarters, at direct odds with the abundance my own steward's ledgers claimed. I could not trust the official channels to tell me the truth, so I decided to see it myself, disguised, unannounced, exactly as an ordinary beggar would experience this city, rather than as its king. And you found me instead," I said. "I found considerably more than I expected to find," he admitted. "I intended to observe quietly for a few weeks at most. I did not intend to be fed, every single morning, by a woman with barely enough bread for herself, who never once asked anything of me in return. I did not know you were a king," I said. "I would have fed you regardless." "That," he said, quiet, "is precisely why I could not stop returning to that gate, long after I had gathered enough information to leave it behind entirely. I did not have an answer ready for that particular honesty, so I simply reached for the small chipped bowl I had, out of pure habit, brought with me from the market that morning, and set it between us on the table, the way I had set it between us every single morning for 4 months. "May I ask," I said, once the quiet had settled, "what you saw, in 4 months of watching?" "Beyond the grain." Something in his face gentled, remembering rather than calculating for once. I saw a city I had genuinely believed I understood, and did not really, not until I sat at the level of the people actually living it, rather than reading reports about it from a comfortable desk. I saw kindness rationed as carefully as bread, and offered anyway, over and over, by people who had every reason to keep what little they had for themselves. He looked at me plainly. "I saw you, most of all. I do not think I fully understood, until this evening, how much of what I was actually looking for in that market I found the very first morning, entirely by accident." I did not know what to say to that, so I said the truest thing I had. "I would have shared that bread with anyone who looked as hungry as you did. I do not regret that it happened to be you." "Neither do I," he said, "though I suspect I owe you a considerably larger debt than a king usually finds himself owing a stranger at a market gate." If you want to find out why King Draken spent 4 months disguised as a silent beggar at that gate, and what nearly happened to me once Lord Varric understood exactly how much I might have seen, stay with me through to the end of this. Follow along so you do not lose the thread of what happens when a king's secret finally meets a kindness that was never conditional on knowing it. Gunnar, once the two of us had settled into something resembling calm, laid out plainly exactly how much danger the investigation had already uncovered. Lord Varric has served as grain steward for 6 years, he said, and has, according to the ledgers we have finally been able to examine properly, been diverting a considerable portion of the capital's stored reserves into private sale along the trade routes, falsifying the official counts to hide the shortfall. The quarters worst affected are, unsurprisingly, the ones with the least standing to complain loudly enough to be heard. I thought of the winters I had spent stretching a single sack of grain further than it should have reasonably gone, of neighbours who had gone without entirely some months, of children in the quarter who had grown thin enough that even old Meris's spare herring could not fully account for it. I had spent years assuming those hardships were simply the ordinary weather of poverty, the ungovernable shape of bad harvests and hard luck. Understanding, in that quiet palace chamber, that a single man's greed had made those winters harder than they needed to be, settled into me with a fury I had not expected myself capable of feeling. How many winters, I asked, my voice tighter than I intended. How many winters did my own quarter go without, so that his household stores could grow? 6, Gunnar said. Quiet. As many as he has held the position. He noticed the king watching, I said slowly, and decided clearing the beggars from that gate was safer than risking discovery. He noticed considerably more than that, Gunnar said grimly. He noticed you specifically, in recent days, and I suspect the clearing order was aimed as much at removing a witness who had spent 4 months close enough to a disguised king to have overheard something dangerous as it was at removing the king himself. I sat with that discovery, a long moment, understanding, with the particular cold clarity of a fact rearranging everything around it. That 4 months of quiet bread sharing had made me a considerably larger threat to Varric's scheme than I had ever imagined myself capable of being. It seemed, on reflection, a strange kind of power to hold. Not wealth, not title, simply proximity freely offered that had somehow become dangerous to the right man for entirely the wrong reasons. I do not want you returning to that gate alone, Draken said, watching my face carefully for whatever reaction his words might draw. Not until this is settled. I have been going to that gate every morning for years, I said. I am not going to stop simply because a man with something to hide has decided my presence there frightens him. That is precisely what frightens me, he admitted, though I understand, better than most, exactly how little good arguing with that particular stubbornness accomplished with me at the start of this. Varric moved first, formally, once his men's failed attempt to simply remove Draken from that gate made plain how close his scheme now sat to discovery. He filed a formal grievance with the Crown's own council, claiming the king's unsanctioned disguise had endangered royal security, and that any information gathered through such irregular means should be dismissed as unreliable. An attempt, I understood immediately, to discredit the very investigation closing in on him. Draken dismissed the grievance publicly, before the same council, presenting instead the falsified ledgers Gunnar had already begun assembling, grain counts that did not match warehouse inventories, trade route sales recorded under names that traced back, through careful investigation, to accounts controlled by Varric's own household. Varric's second move came 4 nights later, and it very nearly succeeded entirely. He sent men to my own lodgings in the quarter, under cover of the same disorder his earlier grievance had claimed to be addressing, intending, I understood only afterward, to remove the one witness whose 4 months of proximity to a disguised king made her considerably too inconvenient to leave free. That is the scene I told you about at the very beginning of this. The grip on my wrist, the cold certainty in the man's voice that I was either a fool or a threat. My own hand still closed around the small chipped bowl I had been carrying home from the gate when the men found me, refusing, even in that moment of genuine fear, to let go of the one thing that had started all of this. And then the sound, low and furious, of Draken's wolf clearing the distance between the palace and that market gate faster than anything with that much weight should have been able to manage. His wolf did not simply subdue the men holding me. It planted itself bodily between me and every remaining threat in that square, teeth bared, a display of raw, undisguised authority the market had never once seen from the silent beggar it had spent 4 months ignoring. You laid hands on the one person in this kingdom who fed your king without asking anything in return, Draken said, arriving a half-second behind his own wolf, his voice gone very quiet and very dangerous. I would ask every witness in this square to remember, plainly, exactly what that tells them about the man who ordered it. Varric himself was found within the hour, attempting to flee the capital through a merchant's cart, bound for the northern trade road. His own household ledgers seized alongside him, providing the final, undeniable proof of 6 years of quiet theft from the very people least able to survive it. I managed this kingdom's grain reserves competently for 6 years, he said, backing away as guards closed around him. A beggar's disguise and a market girl's bread nearly cost me everything I built managing this crown's resources properly. You did not manage this crown's resources, Draken said. You stole from the hungriest people in my kingdom while filing reports that claimed abundance, and when a woman's kindness threatened to expose it, you tried to have her removed rather than simply be caught. I would ask this council to consider whether a man that willing to starve his own people was ever truly serving anyone but himself. He had no answer ready for that, in front of witnesses who would very much repeat every word of it by the time the sun set. Varric was stripped of his position and his freedom that same hour, his household seized for full investigation, and the recovered grain, once properly redistributed, reached the capital's poorest quarters within the week, the first honest allotment that neighbourhood had received in longer than anyone could clearly remember. I stood in the market square myself the morning the grain carts arrived, watching neighbours who had spent 6 winters going without receive, finally what should have been theirs all along, and felt something in my chest ease that I had not realised had been clenched tight for years. Draken found me afterward in that same private chamber, holding the small chipped bowl I had carried with me every morning for 4 months, considerably more worn now than when I had first begun using it. I have spent 4 months learning what it actually means to be hungry, and considerably longer than that, learning what it means to be fed by someone who expects nothing in return, he said. I do not think nearly losing you to Varric's men was the demonstration I had intended to finally understand how much that mattered. It worked anyway, I said, though I would ask you not to repeat it. I do not intend to make a habit of it. He looked at the small bowl still in my hands, then at me, something in his face finally losing the last of its careful, disguised distance. I do not know how to properly court a woman who fed me for 4 months, believing I was nothing but a hungry stranger. I only know I have never once eaten anything that meant more to me than that bread. You already know how, I said. You simply keep showing up, hungry or not, and let me keep breaking the bread in half. That is the only thing you ever needed to do. When he kissed me, careful and certain, a man who had spent 4 months disguised as nothing and had finally stopped needing to hide behind it, I felt something in my chest, some quiet, patient warmth I had carried since the first morning I broke my bread, without thinking twice, finally settle. He claimed me before the full court a month later, his hand steady on the old iron circlet, as he set it on my head himself, in front of every noble who had gone pale in that market square, while a market girl simply asked her king if he was still hungry. Gunnar stood near the front of that hall, looking, for the first time in 4 months, entirely unworried. Old Meris attended the ceremony herself, seated near the front at Draken's own personal invitation, and spent most of the evening loudly informing anyone who would listen that she had always known there was something considerably more than beggar in that silent man's bearing. A claim I found charmingly unverifiable, but did not have the heart to dispute. She brought a strip of dried herring, wrapped carefully in cloth, as her gift, informing us both, with total seriousness, that a king who had once eaten her fish deserved to keep eating it regardless of what crown now sat on his head. 6 months later, I stood at that same market gate, with a letter from my own family in one hand and the small chipped bowl, mended now where a crack had finally threatened to split it entirely, in the other. The letter asked, carefully, whether it was true that their daughter, once counting every heel of bread carefully enough to share it, was queen of the realm now. I wrote back that it was true, and that I still counted every heel of bread carefully, because some habits are worth keeping regardless of how large the kitchen behind you eventually becomes. Gunnar had stopped bracing every time Varric's name came up in court proceedings, mostly, now that the man sat stripped of standing, rather than quietly starving half a city for his own profit. The grain reserves, restored and properly overseen now, had not fallen short of an honest count since, and Draken had, at my own insistence, established a formal review of every steward's ledgers twice yearly, so that no future shortfall could hide behind falsified abundance for as long as this one had. And the capital's poorest quarter, once so easily ignored by a court that never once thought to walk its streets honestly, had quietly become the first place its queen visited every single week, without fail. Draken had taken, in those 6 months, to accompanying me on those weekly visits himself, no longer disguised, though the market's regular traders still greeted him with the easy, unbothered familiarity of people who remembered exactly who he had been before anyone knew his crown. He told me once that he found their honesty considerably more valuable than any council report he had ever received, and that he intended to keep walking those streets openly for as long as he ruled, precisely so no future shortfall could hide behind a comfortable desk's distance from the people it actually affected. He had also established, quietly and without fanfare, a standing arrangement with every market gate in the capital, a small, honest allotment of bread set aside each morning for whoever needed it. No questions asked, no names required. He told me he had modelled it, without much embarrassment, on a woman who had never once asked a hungry stranger for his name before deciding he deserved to eat. I turned the small chipped bowl over in my hands and thought about the woman who had broken her only piece of bread in half 4 months earlier, certain of nothing, except that the silent stranger at the gate looked considerably hungrier than she was willing to leave him. She had no idea, that ordinary difficult morning, that sharing her last piece of bread was about to become the truest, strangest gift she ever gave a king. She only knew he needed to eat. I like to think she would be glad, now, that she never once thought to ask his name before deciding he deserved to be fed, and considerably gladder still that the answer, when it finally came, changed nothing at all about how she felt toward the hungry man at the gate. Do you think Draken chose that particular gate on purpose, some quiet instinct guiding him toward exactly the person who would feed a stranger without asking questions? Or was it simply fortunate that the woman with the least to spare turned out to have the most to give? Tell me your theory in the comments. And if you want to stay at this gate a little longer, comment the bread, and I will know exactly what you are asking for. Thank you for breaking that bread with me. Wherever you are listening from tonight, welcome to Draken's Court. Follow along for the next story from this side of the border. There are more kings in these hills hiding in plain sight, waiting to find out who will feed them without ever asking what they are owed for it. And I intend to tell you every one of their stories.